Out of 40,000 German U-boat men who served in World War II, 30,000 never returned.
Yeah, that number is just, it's hard to even process.
It really is. I really want you listening right now to just sit with that statistic for a second.
Right, because we hear these massive numbers thrown around in history all the time.
Yeah, exactly. It's so easy to let them just wash over you as raw data. But stop and think about the actual human math here. 30,000 out of 40,000.
As a 75% mortality rate.
I mean, I want you to imagine, just for a moment, volunteering for a job, and a highly specialized elite job, mind you.
Oh yeah, they were considered the absolute elite.
Right, and you know going in that if you look at the three colleagues standing right next to you, statistically speaking, all three of them are destined to die.
And you were the only one walking away?
Or, maybe you're one of the three. It's just this almost impossible reality to wrap your head around.
It really is a genuinely staggering figure. And the reason we have to start there, like right at the top of this deep dive into the source material, is because it just instantly shatters any of those romanticized Hollywood illusions we might have about submarine warfare.
Right. There's no glory in a 75% casualty rate.
Exactly. When you're dealing with those kinds of numbers, you aren't really talking about conventional combat strategy anymore. You're talking about a slaughter.
Yeah.
It's a war of attrition where human beings are basically the primary resource being expended. And that grim, unavoidable reality, it completely dictates the psychological landscape of the men who actually live through it.
Every single action they take.
Every action, every joke they make, every moment of terror, it's all underpinned by the mathematical certainty of their own impending deaths.
Which is just so incredibly bleak. And you don't have to just imagine what that psychological landscape looks like, because today we actually have the receipts.
We really do. The sources for today are amazing.
Yeah, we have the firsthand diaries. We're unpacking this incredibly intimate, super visceral account written by a naval war correspondent. And he was actually embedded on a German VAC U-boat.
Right. He was physically sealed inside one of these steel tubes in the fall of 1941.
And we are pulling all of this from Lothar-Günther Buchheim's heavily autobiographical and honestly deeply revealing text, Das Boot, or The Boat.
Which is such a crucial anchor point for us today. The timing here, the fall of 1941, is absolutely everything.
Why is that specific time frame so important?
Well, it places us at this massive, terrifying pivot point in world history, and specifically in the history of the war. Because, if this were 1939 or 1940, we'd be talking about what they called the happy time for the U-boats.
Right, when they were basically sinking Allied shipping with near impunity.
Exactly. But late 1941, the German war machine, which had seemed completely unstoppable, has just violently stalled in the freezing mud right before Moscow.
And things are changing in Africa, too.
Yeah, down in North Africa, the British are suddenly aggressively on the offensive. And perhaps most ominously of all for the guys we're talking about today, the United States is just on the precipice of entering the war following Pearl Harbor.
Which means the sheer industrial might of America is about to be brought to bear against them.
Exactly. The tide is definitively, irreversibly turning. The U-boat crews are starting to realize that the hunters are very quickly becoming the hunted. And the men on the front lines, they can feel it in their bones.
So our mission today is to basically strip away all that polished, sterile military propaganda that usually surrounds the specific era of history.
Right. We want to plunge you directly into the claustrophobic, terrifying, darkly comic, and shockingly mundane reality of submarine warfare.
Yeah, we aren't just going to look at the nuts and bolts of how an iron machine dives, that we are definitely going to get into that.
Oh, the engineering is fascinating.
It is. But we really want to explore the psychological breaking point of the men forced to live inside it. But here's the thing. If we really want to understand the terror of living inside a steel tube at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, we can't actually start in the ocean.
No, we have to look at their psychological state right before they get sealed inside.
Exactly. The sources open on their very last night ashore, and it shows us exactly how these men cope with this absolute doom hanging over their heads.
And it is such a vital, revealing starting point.
Yep.
Because you simply cannot understand their erratic, desperate behavior at sea without witnessing their complete degradation on land first.
Right, and the text takes us to this specific place, the Bar Royal, in coastal France.
Yeah, and to really understand the Bar Royal, you have to understand the military bureaucracy that set it up.
It wasn't just some local dive bar, right?
Not at all. This establishment was officially requisitioned by the military brass. Their stated goal was to provide these returning U-boat men with uh, refined relaxation. That was the actual word they used.
Mm.
Refined. Yeah. So they brought in these artificial grapevines. They draped the walls in heavy red silk curtains. They hired an exhausted madam to run the place. And they even brought in a French singer named Monique.
So the high command truly believed they were creating this dignified, restorative officers club for their elite
They
heroes.
really did. But the reality is just absolute grotesque chaos.
Yeah.
I mean, it is the furthest thing from refined.
The scene in the book is unbelievable. When our narrator approaches the bar alongside the commander of the U-boat, they literally have to drive their car through a gauntlet of heavily intoxicated sailors.
And they aren't just standing around having a smoke either.
No.
Ugh.
There is a line of men standing shoulder to shoulder all the way across the coastal road, and they are urinating at attention.
The commander actually has to slalom his car back and forth just to avoid running them over.
And the guys barely even register the vehicle. And then once they get inside the doors, it's just pure madness. You've got the madam standing there wringing her hands in total despair as the place is systematically torn apart by the crew.
And you have Monique, the singer, right? She's trying to perform this sultry, melancholy French song, and the sailors are basically rioting all around her. They're completely ignoring the performance.
It's just a scene of complete frantic decay.
It really is. And the text is brilliant in how it uses specific characters to illustrate that decay. Like, it focuses heavily on this one U-boat commander named Truman.
Oh, Truman, this guy is a mess.
He is legendary in the fleet, but not for sinking ships. He's the captain of what they mockingly call the barrage boat. He is cursed with almost supernatural bad luck.
Right, he never actually finds convoys when he goes out.
Never. Instead, he constantly gets caught in enemy anti-submarine barrages. He's constantly hunted and bombed by aircraft. His machinery completely breaks down.
And he frequently has to limp back to the French ports, as he puts it, on knees and nipples.
Exactly. He just absorbs punishment patrol after patrol.
Mm.
And in the Bar Royal, Truman is just a walking embodiment of absolutely shattered nerves.
The description of him is so vivid, he's got cigarette butts physically smoldering in his hair.
And he doesn't even notice them.
Right, and he's wearing his Knight's Cross Medal, which is, one of the highest military honors you can get. He's wearing it backward around his neck like a bib.
And his behavior just escalates as the night goes on. It goes from just being weird and bizarre to outright aggressively dangerous.
Yeah, tell me about the toilet brush.
Okay, so at one point, Truman grabs this dripping, filthy toilet brush. He staggers over to a fellow commander who had just recently been awarded a medal, and he performs this mock, tearful knighting ceremony right in the middle of the crowded bar.
With a used toilet brush.
Yes, and he's shouting and raving about their shitty clown of a national leader and mocking the enemy. It's incredibly subversive.
And it gets worse.
It does.
Huh.
He then demands total silence from the rioting room, and he decides he's going to pull off the classic tablecloth trick. But he does it on a massive table that is completely covered in dozens of full champagne bottles and crystal glasses. And of course, it fails spectacularly.
I can just imagine the noise.
It results in this jarring, deafening cascade of shattered glass and spilled wine literally everywhere. But the crazy part is, Truman doesn't laugh it off like a party foul.
What does he do?
He ends up crawling around on his hands and knees through the shards, physically bleeding all over his own hands, stubbornly trying to sweep it all up with a tiny broom and dustpan while the party just rages over his head.
That is so dark.
And if that wasn't enough of a red flag that this man is broken, he actually just stands up, pulls out 2 loaded service pistols, and starts shooting up the bar.
Literally blasting the plaster faces off the decorative murals painted on the walls.
Yeah. And you would think that a military officer wildly firing 2 handguns in a crowded room would cause a massive panic.
I would certainly think so.
But the incredible thing is, the other veteran commanders barely even react. The old man, which is how the crew refers to the commander of the boat our narrator is joining, he just calmly watches the bullets fly.
He just sits there.
He slides down a little lower in his heavy leather chair, just to avoid any ricochets, and he quietly counts the gunshots until Truman's magazines are entirely empty. He doesn't even flinch.
Wow. For these men, this isn't an emergency at all.
No, it's Tuesday. It is completely normalized behavior.
Listening to you describe this, it really hits me. This isn't a nightclub. It's not a frat party. It sounds like, I don't know, a really loud waiting room for death.
That's a perfect way to describe it.
It just seems like this extreme drunkenness, the shooting at walls, the destruction of the bar. It isn't just sailors letting off steam after a tough week at work.
Yeah.
It reads like a desperate, frantic coping mechanism for men whose brains have fundamentally broken.
That is exactly what it is. And the text provides this perfect, violent anecdote to prove that these men have absolutely zero patience for anyone who doesn't understand their reality.
The story about the bureaucrat, right?
Yeah. The narrator recounts this flashback story of a pompous official, a commissioner of works, who showed up at the Bar Royal one night a few weeks prior. This guy is a civilian bureaucrat, dressed nicely, and he starts spouting official military propaganda to the room. He's standing there telling these exhausted, traumatized, oil-soaked sailors that they need to stiffen their spines against enemy depth charges.
You've got to be kidding me.
He's babbling on about the glory of sacrifice and the necessity of holding the line.
Right. And they don't even bother to debate him, do they?
No, they don't say a single word in response. According to the text, 4 of the veteran sailors simply stand up, walk over to the commissioner, and silently pick him up by his wrists and ankles.
Like a piece of furniture.
Literally. They swing him back and forth like a hammock to build momentum, and then they physically launch him straight through the bar's thick plate glass window, just shattering it and tossing him out into the cobblestone street.
Which is just a stunning image. But wait, let me ask you this. If everyone in the bar is acting like this, if they are all cynical and broken and throwing bureaucrats through windows, how does the military even function?
Right, it seems impossible.
Are there any sailors who actually believe the propaganda they are being fed?
Yes, and that is where the deep generational tragedy of this source material really comes into focus. The Bar Royal scene highlights a profound, unbridgeable fracture within the ranks.
Between the older guys and the newer guys.
Exactly. You have the old warriors, men like the commander, Truman, and another heavily decorated captain named Thompson. These men are deeply cynical. They know the undeniable truth of the Atlantic.
Which is that they're all probably going to die.
Yeah. They know they are living on borrowed time and that their luck is rapidly running out. Thompson, for example, is so psychologically shattered by what he's seen that by the end of the night, the narrator finds him passed out in the men's washroom.
Oh, that scene is so rough.
He's lying face down in a puddle of his own vomit and urine, with his brand new Knight's Cross medal just dragging in the mess.
Yeah.
That is what the veterans look like. But the text contrasts them sharply with what it calls the young strutters.
Okay, so who exactly are the young strutters?
They are the newly indoctrinated, hyper-philosophical youth who are pouring out of the naval academies to replace all the dead men. The text describes them as chin thrusters.
Chin thrusters.
Yeah, they literally stand in front of mirrors practicing intimidating, heroic facial expressions. They walk on the balls of their feet with their bodies aggressively inclined forward, as if they're constantly leaning into some glorious headwind.
Wow, so they are fully drinking the Kool-Aid.
Oh, completely. They blindly, fervently believe the sterile propaganda about final victory, about the nobility of the cause, and about glorious sacrifice.
And how do the veterans view them?
The veterans despise them. The strutters are incredibly eager to prove themselves, incredibly serious about military protocol, and according to the cynical veterans who actually have to serve with them, they are incredibly dangerous.
Dangerous because they don't know what they're doing.
Dangerous because their blind, dogmatic faith makes them inflexible, and inflexibility gets you killed underwater. They are incompetent at the actual gritty, undignified job of surviving a depth charge attack because they're too busy trying to be heroes to be good mechanics.
That contrast is just incredibly stark, and it makes perfect sense because as the hangovers fade into the foggy, freezing reality of the next morning, that psychological prison of the bar gives way to the physical prison of the submarine.
Right, the real nightmare begins.
Exactly. We transition away from the chaos of the night and move into the stark, gray, industrial reality of the harbor at St. Nazaire. And before we even get to the boat itself, the source describes the bunker where the boats are kept.
The U-boat pens.
Yeah, and I have to say, the sheer scale of these pens, the way they're described, is just hard to fathom.
The engineering is truly monolithic.
Yeah.
And it was designed with a very specific, terrifying purpose, which was total invulnerability from the sky.
They weren't just simple docks.
Not at all. These pens aren't just garages. They are massive, sprawling concrete caves built directly into the water to protect the submarines from heavy Allied aerial bombardment while they are in port undergoing repairs.
And the roofs on these things are insane.
The text spends a lot of time marveling at them. They are described as being over 20 feet thick, poured from heavily reinforced concrete. They're engineered to be so immensely strong that they can withstand direct perpendicular hits from armor-piercing bombs the size of telephone booths.
The text actually mentions a specific bombing rate to illustrate this, right?
Yes. The narrator describes looking around the heavily bombed harbor area surrounding the pens. He sees a massive heavy car that was physically lifted by the shockwave of a bomb blast and blown completely onto the roof of a destroyed six-story building.
So there's just total devastation all around.
Total devastation.
Yeah.
And yet the bunker itself, sitting right in the middle of this pulverized landscape, remains utterly unpenetrated, not a single crack letting light in. It stands as this fascinating, almost ironic contrast, the absolute, immovable, concrete invulnerability of the fortress, designed to house and protect the incredibly fragile, paper-thin boats hiding inside it.
Fragile is a really interesting word choice there. Because when most of us picture a submarine, we picture this solid, impenetrable steel leviathan. But the VIC U-boat, as it's detailed in the text, isn't really that at all, is it?
No, not at all.
First of all, it's shockingly small. The text notes it is about 220 feet long, which sounds substantial, but it's only 20 feet wide at its absolute widest point.
That's basically a very long, narrow tube.
Right. And more importantly, the text reveals this fascinating mechanical illusion about what a submarine actually is. A U-boat isn't a solid ship like a battleship.
No, the structure is completely different.
It is essentially a thick, pressure-resistant cylinder, a pipe, really, where the men, engines, and weapons live. But that inner pipe is completely hidden under a thin, non-pressure-resistant outer skin made of sheet metal.
That's right. The outer shell, the part that actually looks like the sleek hull of a boat, is just there for hydrodynamics. It gives the craft a boat-like shape so it can travel somewhat efficiently when it is surfaced, but it has absolutely no structural integrity against the deep ocean.
The narrator actually realizes this when they're in dry dock, right?
Yeah, he has this moment of realization when he walks through the dry dock and sees a damaged U-boat that has had its outer skin cut away by welders' blowtorches. He looks at the inner pressure hull surrounded by the skeletal framing of the outer shell, and he describes it as looking like an eviscerated whale.
That's a brutal description.
He realizes that these terrifying weapons of war are essentially, as he puts it, inflatable DT fish.
But wait, let me ask you this. If the outer shell is just thin sheet metal, why doesn't the immense pressure of the ocean just crush it the second the boat dies?
Because the spaces between that thin outer skin and the thick inner pressure hull aren't empty.
Oh, they fill them.
Exactly. When the boat dives, those spaces are deliberately flooded with seawater. The water fills the gaps, equalizing the pressure on both the inside and outside of that thin metal skin.
Oh, I see.
If they didn't flood those outer compartments, the pressure of the ocean would instantly crush the outer shell against the inner hull, like you stepping on an empty soda can.
So the only part of the submarine that is actually fighting the pressure of the ocean and keeping the men alive is that inner cylinder.
Yes. And the actual living space inside that pressure cylinder is horrifyingly cramped.
Cramped almost feels like an understatement. I mean, you have 50 full-grown men crammed into this narrow tube, and it's not like it's a hollow tube where they can just lay out sleeping bags on the floor.
Oh, no, they aren't just sharing space with each other.
Right, they are sharing it with two massive, incredibly loud diesel engines, two electric motors, miles of pipes and valves, 14 massive torpedoes, and 120 heavy cannon shells for the deck gun.
Everywhere you look, there's machinery or explosives.
The text describes hammocks bulging with loaves of bread swinging just inches over the men's heads because literally every square inch of volume is utilized for provisions or machinery. There is no dedicated mess hall. There are no washrooms.
The logistics of just existing, let alone sleeping, are an absolute nightmare. They are forced to practice a system called warm bunks.
What does that mean exactly?
Well, there simply aren't enough physical beds for all 50 men. The boat operates on a straight watch system, so a percentage of the crew is always awake and working. When one sailor finishes his grueling 6-hour watch and stumbles back to sleep, another exhausted man is waking up to take his place.
So they just swap.
Yes. The man going on watch climbs out of the bunk, and the man coming off watch immediately slides into the exact same bunk, literally crawling into the stale, sweaty, still warm sheets his crewmate just vacated.
That sounds absolutely miserable.
It is a continuous rotation of bodies in a deeply unsanitary environment.
And speaking of unsanitary, even trying to use the toilet requires a strategic planning session. The VIC technically has 2 small toilets on board, but they are going out to sea for weeks, maybe months at a time.
Right, they need all the storage they can get.
So the crew entirely fills one of the toilets with food provisions, boxes of cans, sausages, whatever will fit. It is locked and completely unusable for its intended purpose.
Which leaves them with one toilet.
Exactly. That means 50 men eating heavy, greasy military rations all share a single pump-operated toilet, which the text refers to as Cabin H. During the morning rush hour or right after a major watch change, access to Cabin H becomes a desperate, agonizing bottleneck.
They can only imagine the tension.
Hearing all these details, it feels less like they're serving on a naval ship and more like, I don't know, they've been stuffed into a sausage casing.
That's a great analogy.
It really feels like the naval architects and designers sat down and engineered perfect, highly customized spaces for the torpedoes, the dials, and the massive diesel engines. And then, once the machine was perfect, they just looked at whatever tiny, awkward, leftover gaps remained in the floorboards and treated the human crew as the absolute least important filler to be shoved into those gaps.
They absolutely did.
I mean, the men literally sleep on top of thin metal floor plates that are directly covering active explosives in the bilge.
It is a very astute, if disturbing, observation, and it's really a core theme of the source text. The design philosophy of the VIC is abundantly clear to anyone who steps inside it. It is a weapon first, second, and third. It is a habitat almost not at all.
Right.
Every single inch of space, every pound of weight is coldly calculated for combat efficiency and lethality, not for human endurance or comfort. And this philosophy leads to this profoundly grim detail in the narrative.
About the torpedoes, right?
Yeah, the narrator observes that whenever the crew manages to successfully fire a torpedo in combat, they erupt in celebration.
Well, sure, they're celebrating sinking an enemy ship, right? That makes sense.
That's part of it, of course.
Yeah.
But the text makes it clear that they're celebrating something much more immediate and personal.
Which is?
A torpedo weighs roughly 1.5 tons, and it takes up a massive amount of physical volume in the torpedo room, which is also where the men sleep. When they fire one out of the tube, it literally empties a massive metal cylinder from inside their tiny living quarters.
Oh, wow.
The men are cheering because firing a weapon grants them an extra few cubic feet of physical space to breathe, to stretch their legs, to hang a wet jacket.
That is unbelievably bleak.
Yeah, firing a weapon of mass destruction is their only available method to create enough physical room just to exist slightly more comfortably.
Your reward for engaging in combat is just a little more room to breathe. So armed with this understanding, knowing exactly what this boat is, knowing that it's essentially a tiny, fragile, overcrowded pipe bomb, we have to look at how the military presents it leaving port versus how the men inside actually experience it.
The departure ceremony.
Right. The source details their official farewell ceremony at St. Nazaire, and the contrast between the reality we just described and the pageantry on the docks is completely jarring.
It is a masterclass in farcical, tone-deaf propaganda. Picture the scene. The boat is slowly slipping out of this heavily bombed, oily, freezing, mist-covered harbor.
Very grim.
Very grim. And standing on the safety of the concrete docks, there is a full military band in crisp uniforms blaring triumphant, heroic marching music. Local girls in naval auxiliaries are throwing fresh flowers onto the rusted deck of the submarine.
Like a parade.
Exactly. And frantically scurrying around the exhausted, hungover crew are two military propagandist journalists sent by the ministry. The narrator actually likens these two men to the comedy duo Laurel and Hardy.
They're just getting in the way.
Totally. They're desperate. They're shoving microphones in the sailors' faces, trying to extract heroic, cliched sound bites about the crew's continuously increased effort and their unbreakable will to attack. They want a neat, inspiring story for the newsreels back home.
It's ridiculous. It's like a flashy halftime show at a gladiator match. You have all this pomp and circumstance, all this swelling music, and cheering for the audience sitting safely in the stands, while the gladiators themselves are just standing there shivering in the cold.
Right. They just want to get past the cheering so they can get down to the grim, miserable business of surviving the arena.
And nobody, absolutely nobody, embodies this total disconnect more than the old man, the commander of the boat.
The commander is such a fascinating figure here. His mere physical appearance on the bridge during this ceremony is an act of quiet, steadfast rebellion against the whole propaganda machine.
How so?
Well, while the journalists and the brass demand pristine, sharp-dressed, square-jawed heroes for their cameras, the commander turns up on the bridge wearing a filthy, faded, green-tinged, ancient pea jacket that looks like it's been dragged through oil.
He doesn't even try to look the part.
No. He is wearing his Knight's Cross again, this incredibly prestigious medal. But the ceremonial ribbon is completely twisted and frayed into a dirty string. He stands up there, leaning against the cold metal, smoking a cheap cigar with absolute, utter indifference to the pageantry happening 20 feet away from him.
He just openly despises the propagandists.
He despises their pristine uniforms, and he especially despises their sterile bureaucratic language.
The language thing is really fascinating. The text specifically notes his deep disgust for the term tonnage, right?
Yes, the military high command, the politicians, and the newspapers constantly use the word tonnage to describe the U-boat successes, like, we sank 100,000 tons of Allied shipping this month.
It sounds like a factory metric.
Exactly. They use tonnage to abstract the violence. It makes the war sound like a spreadsheet, an industrial quota being met by hard workers. But the commander knows the intimate truth of what that word means.
He sees the reality.
He knows that destroying tonnage doesn't mean crossing a number out on a ledger. It means tearing apart magnificent, beautifully engineered steel ships.
Yeah.
And more importantly, it means burning, maiming, and drowning hundreds of terrified human beings in the freezing dark of the Atlantic.
He refuses to let the propagandists sanitize the murder he is ordered to commit.
Right.
That brings up a massive contradiction, though. I mean, if the commander holds such a deep hatred for this propaganda, if he is so acutely aware of the horrific human cost hidden behind the word tonnage, how does he reconcile that with his actual job?
It's a tough balance.
Because his literal duty, the reason he is on that boat, is to go out and sink those ships and drown those men. How does he mentally survive that hypocrisy?
He survives it by aggressively stripping away all the ideological illusions the state tries to provide him. He completely refuses to buy into the rhetoric of being a noble knight of the deep fighting for a glorious, righteous cause.
He doesn't care about the politics at all.
Not at all. He doesn't believe in the politics. He has reduced his entire existence, his entire philosophy of command, to a brutal, fundamental, almost prehistoric equation. He attacks so as not to be destroyed.
Pure self-defense.
It is pure animal survival. It's kill or be killed, completely devoid of any flags or anthems.
There's a moment in the text that captures that, isn't there? Like right as they're sailing out.
There is. It is a profoundly melancholic, philosophical moment that perfectly encapsulates his worldview.
What happens?
As the U-boat is finally leaving the harbor, leaving the band and the flowers behind, the commander stands on the bridge and watches the boat's churning white wake spreading out behind them in the dark water. And he notes how quickly the immense ocean simply smooths over, swallows the foam, and erases any evidence that the submarine was ever there. He explicitly likens that disappearing wake to human mortality. He realizes that the ocean is vast, ancient, and entirely indifferent. It quickly erases all human illusions of permanence, grandeur, and military glory, just as it will eventually erase him and his crew. The sea doesn't care about the propaganda, the tonnage, or the iron crosses.
That is almost nihilistic.
Very much so.
So they leave the harbor, the marching music fades into the distance, and the commander's philosophical dread is almost immediately replaced by highly technical, constant physical peril.
The reality of operating the boat.
Because once they are out on the open sea, they can't just philosophize. They have to actually operate this incredibly complex machine. And the source goes into deep, painstaking detail about the terrifying science of what they call balancing the boat.
Yes, the act of making a nearly 1,000-ton iron tube hover perfectly motionless underwater is not as simple as just, turning a steering wheel downward. It is an incredibly delicate, constantly shifting science.
That's not like flying a plane.
No. In the text, the chief engineer, who was basically the wizard of the submarine, explains the deep mechanics of diving to the narrator. You see, unlike a surface ship, which naturally floats by displacing an amount of water equal to its own weight, a U-boat has to actively manipulate its buoyancy.
How do they do that?
It achieves positive buoyancy floating on the surface by trapping air in those massive external ballast tanks we mentioned earlier, the spaces between the inner and outer hull.
Right, so they have tanks full of air holding them up, but getting underwater is only the first step of the problem.
Exactly.
To dive, they open heavy steel vents at the top of those tanks to let the trapped air violently escape, and they open huge flood holes at the bottom to let the heavy seawater rush in and pull them under. But once they are down there, they don't want to just sink like a stone to the bottom.
That would be bad.
They have to achieve a state of perfect trim, meaning the submarine isn't sinking and it isn't rising. It has to hover in the water column like a blimp in the air. And to do that, it relies entirely on the specific gravity of the salt water outside the hull.
And this is where the math becomes absolutely terrifying, because the specific gravity, the density of the ocean, is not a constant. It is a highly variable, living thing.
It changes.
It changes constantly based on the depth they are diving to, the temperature of the water at that specific depth, the amount of evaporation caused by the sun on the surface that day, which leaves behind saltier, denser water.
Even the plankton.
Yes, even the concentration of microscopic plankton floating in a particular current can change the density. The chief engineer explains the terrifying margins to the narrator. He says that the specific gravity of the water around them changes by just one-thousandth,
A tiny fraction.
a practically microscopic, invisible fraction. Their 880-ton boat is instantly thrown off balance by over 1,600 pounds.
Hold on, let me make sure I understand that. 1,600 pounds of force pushing them up or down just from a one-thousandth change in the water's density.
Exactly. And the crew has to constantly manually counteract this by pumping highly pressurized water back and forth between internal regulating tanks located at the front and back of the submarine.
So they're always adjusting.
Always. To maintain that perfect hover, they literally have to balance this massive steel warship to within roughly 11 pounds of perfect equilibrium.
11 pounds. On an 880-ton ship, that's insane. The chief actually gives a crazy mundane example in the text that really drove this home for me.
The potato sack story.
Yes. He tells the narrator that if a single crew member moves a 100-weight sack of potatoes from the forward torpedo room to the aft galley, the chief engineer physically has to pump the exact equivalent weight of water in the opposite direction just to keep the submarine from tilting and losing its level depth.
It sounds totally absurd to us.
It's like a tightrope walker trying to juggle bowling pins. But while he's juggling, someone is randomly turning a dial that changes the gravity in the room. Just the simple act of a few guys walking from the front of the boat to the bathroom could, theoretically, tip the submarine out of its safe zone.
It sounds absurd to a layman, sure, but for the crew, it is a constant matter of life and death. Because what happens if they lose that balance?
What does happen?
Well, if the boat is even slightly too light, it begins to drift upward. And if they're operating at periscope depth, trying to stay hidden just below the waves, and the boat unexpectedly pops up just 3 or 4 feet, the periscope breaches the surface too far.
Which gives away their position.
Right. The thick metal shears the water, creating a highly visible foaming white wake that instantly alerts enemy bombers and destroyer escorts to their exact pinpoint location. It's a death sentence.
And what if they get too heavy?
Conversely, if they take on too much water and the boat becomes too heavy, it begins an uncontrollable accelerating slide downward toward the crushing decks of the ocean floor, where the pressure hull will simply implode.
And we actually see the terrifying reality of that depth in the text. The commander orders a trial deep dive test to see what the repaired boat can handle.
This part is so tense.
Now, the official factory-guaranteed crush depth of the VIC is listed at 300 feet. But in this test, they intentionally bypass that and go down to 500 feet.
They push it way past the limit.
The narrator describes the sensory terror of this perfectly. The immense pressure of the ocean is literally squeezing the steel cylinder, physically shrinking it.
You can see it happening inside.
Yeah, the men can see strings tight across the ceiling physically sag as the walls close in on them. And then at 500 feet, they hear this horrific, ear-splitting, metallic screeching sound echoing through the hull.
Oh, man.
And they realize the submarine is literally scraping its belly on the rocky bottom of the ocean floor. It's absolute nightmare fuel.
It is deeply traumatic. And because the margins between life and death are so razor thin, the commander is obsessed with the crew's reflexes. He knows they have to maintain this delicate balance under extreme duress.
So what does he do?
He employs these brutal training methods. The text describes him ordering a sudden, violent disaster drill right in the middle of the crew's mealtime, completely without warning.
He intentionally crashes the boat while they're eating.
He simulates a catastrophic flood. He orders the hydroplane shoved hard over. The boat pitches violently forward at a steep downward angle.
Chaos.
Complete chaos. Men are scrambling, losing their footing. Ceramic plates are shattering against the bulkheads, and scalding hot soup is flying everywhere, physically burning the men. He creates total panic.
Why would he do that to them?
He does this because the margins of error, as we discussed, are zero. If an actual attack happens, the crew cannot panic. They must react with pure, instantaneous muscle memory to adjust the dive planes and operate the heavy brass pump valves, or the water will claim them.
And the reason the chief engineer is so fanatically obsessed with their diving speed, and the reason the commander is running these brutal soup-spilling drills, is because of the stark strategic reality of 1941 that we mentioned at the start.
Right, the war has changed.
The U-boat is no longer the apex predator of the Atlantic. They aren't the ones doing the ambushing anymore. The turning point of the war means the hunters are now the hunted, and the main existential threat doesn't come from other ships, it comes from the sky.
Death from above. Throughout the entirety of the text, the pervasive, inescapable terror that haunts every waking moment is this sudden aircraft alarm.
How much time do they have when they spot a plane?
When the lookout on the bridge spots an Allied plane, they have mere seconds to disappear. The physical toll of what they call a crash dive is incredibly brutal. It's not the orderly, calm descent you see in older movies.
It's violent.
It is so violent. The alarm bell rings, and the men on the bridge violently throw themselves down the narrow, vertical steel tower hatch. They are literally stepping on each other's necks, kicking each other in the faces in their absolute frantic desperation to get inside before the hatch is sealed.
And they're slamming into things on the way down.
They slam painfully into metal levers and hand wheels on the way down. It's a miracle they don't break bones every time.
And their job isn't done when they hit the floor, right? They have to help the boat sink.
Exactly. Once they hit the deck plates, every available man who isn't actively operating a valve has to desperately rush to the extreme front of the boat, the bow compartment.
To weigh it down.
Yes. They have to physically weigh down the front of the submarine with their own collective body mass, so the boat will angle downward more sharply and slip beneath the surface faster. A delay of 3 seconds can mean a bomb tearing through the pressure hull.
But wait, this brings up a massive question for anyone who isn't a naval historian. If surfacing is so incredibly dangerous, if the planes are everywhere, why are they on the surface to begin with?
It's a great question.
Why don't they just stay safely underwater for the entire patrol?
It speaks to the technological limitations of the era. They surface because they absolutely have to. They have no choice. The U-boat relies on massive, air-breathing diesel engines for its main propulsion.
So they need air.
Those engines require enormous amounts of fresh atmospheric air to run, and they need to exhaust toxic gases. They can only run the diesels when the boat is surfaced and the hatches are open.
So what do they use when they are underwater?
When they submerge, they have to completely shut off the diesels, seal the exhaust valves, and switch over to running on their electric motors, which draw power from massive banks of lead-acid batteries hidden under the floorboards.
Okay, so the electric motors don't need air.
Right, the electric motors are silent and don't need air. But battery power is extremely limited. If they run at top underwater speed, the batteries are drained in about an hour. Even creeping along slowly, they only get a few days.
And when they run out?
Eventually, the batteries run flat. And when they do, the submarine is entirely paralyzed. They're forced to surface, open the hatches, and run the loud, smoky diesel engines for hours on end just to turn the generators and recharge those batteries.
So they are basically sitting ducks during that time.
Exactly. During that recharging time, they are moving slowly, they are highly visible, and they are entirely exposed to the sky.
That limitation completely flips the script on how we view these machines. We always think of submarines as these silent, invisible, predatory assassins lurking in the deep.
But they're not.
No. Reading this, understanding that they must surface and sit there for hours to breathe and charge, it feels more like they are a gazelle at a watering hole. They are incredibly vulnerable, constantly looking up, terrified of a hawk swooping down.
The paranoia is intense.
The text describes the lookout standing on the bridge during these surface runs, and it's agonizing. They are staring through heavy Zeiss binoculars into the blinding glare of the sun, or the pitch black of night, until their eyes physically water and sting.
They are terrified of a plane using the sun's glare to dive at them unseen.
And that paranoia extends beyond just the ocean, right?
Yeah, they believe that their enemies are everywhere. The crew firmly believes that there are British spies and French informants embedded back at the Bar Royal or working on the docks who radio the RAF the exact moment their specific U-boat leaves port. They feel like marked men from the second they cast off the lines.
Is that paranoia justified, though? Are the Allied planes really that dangerous in 1941?
It is entirely justified. The strategic landscape was shifting rapidly. Allied radar technology was getting smaller and more accurate, allowing planes to detect a surfaced U-boat even in thick fog or the dead of night.
So they couldn't even hide in the dark anymore?
No. And Coastal Command air patrols were extending their range exponentially. The commander acknowledges this massive shift in power. He isn't dismissive of the enemy. He actually holds a grudging, grim respect for the Allied pilots hunting them.
He actually tells a story about an enemy pilot, right? To prove his point to the crew.
He does. To illustrate the caliber of the men trying to kill them, he recounts a story about an unbelievably brave RAF pilot. This British pilot was tasked with bombing the heavily defended German battleship Gneisenau.
That ship was loaded with anti-aircraft guns.
It was. But instead of dropping his bombs from a safe, inaccurate high altitude, the pilot flew his massive, lumbering bomber into a steep, almost suicidal spiral glide right through a wall of anti-aircraft fire, just to ensure he perfectly dropped his bomb on the ship's deck.
And the craziest part of that story is what they found when they recovered the pilot, right?
Yes. The commander notes that when they looked into the pilot's actions, they discovered he didn't even pack standard survival gear for his incredibly dangerous mission. He didn't bring extra rations or escape maps.
What did he bring?
The only personal items he brought with him were a handful of condoms because he fully intended to survive diving through a wall of flak, land safely, and spend his weekend leave partying in Paris.
That is wild.
It's a darkly humorous anecdote, but the commander tells it for a very specific reason. It proves to his men that the enemy they are facing is absolutely fearless, highly capable, intensely motivated, and coming specifically for them.
Okay, so they are constantly hunted by fearless pilots, they're executing these violent crash dives, and they are struggling to maintain buoyancy. But in between those terrifying adrenaline-fueled seconds of aircraft alarms, the men have to actually live inside this humid, vibrating machine for weeks, sometimes months on end.
The day-to-day existence is grueling.
How does the human psyche adapt to this completely unnatural, hostile ecosystem? It's not just the acute fear of death, it's the chronic, sheer sensory overload of just existing in that space.
The sensory environment of a VIC U-boat is an absolute non-stop assault on the human body. The narrator actually takes a shift working in the diesel engine room just to experience it, and his description is incredibly visceral.
What's it like?
First, there's the noise. The deafening mechanical roar of the twin diesel engines is so loud in that confined steel box that the men have to wear heavy ear protection, and even then, they communicate entirely through hand signals.
I can't even imagine that noise.
And the heavy iron floor plates are constantly violently vibrating against the soles of their boots, rattling their bones. The heat radiating from the engines is suffocating, often reaching well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit.
And it's not just hot and loud, it's physically dangerous just to stand there.
Extremely dangerous. At one point, the narrator watches the chief mechanic, a man named Johann, checking the engines. Johann opens a small petcock valve on the side of the massive diesel block to check the combustion.
And what happens?
The pressure is so intense that the valve literally shoots a blinding stream of raw fire straight out into the Krantz room. Johann just casually dodges it like it's nothing. It is a technological hellscape.
And we haven't even touched on the smell yet.
Oh, the smell. The text emphasizes the inescapable, nauseating miasma inside the pressure hull.
What is that combination of smells?
It is a thick blend of acrid diesel exhaust, the sharp tang of battery acid, the smell of rotting food, the body odor of 50 unwashed men wearing damp wool, and beneath it all, the gag-inducing stench of rank, oily bilge water constantly sloshing into the floorboards.
And how do they cope with that? Because you can't just, meditate your way out of a sensory hell like that. To survive, the crew develops a very specific aggressive coping mechanism, and the text documents it extensively. Locker room talk.
Oh, yes. The banter is extreme.
The banter between the men, specifically guys like the giant mechanic Ario, the cynical pilgrim, and the young witchman, is absolutely relentless.
Yeah.
It is crude, it is deeply profane, and it is intensely, almost aggressively sexual. They just sit around in the dark telling bizarre, hyper-vulgar stories.
They really do. The text is very, very frank about this.
So, one guy tells this long, convoluted story about going to visit his prim and proper future in-laws, and while sitting on their fancy furniture, he reaches down and finds a 5-pack of condoms stuffed deep down into the sofa cushions.
And then another guy jumps in.
Yeah, another sailor interrupts him to tell this absurd, highly graphic, and physically impossible joke about a man accidentally backing his naked body into an industrial circular saw. Just nonstop, filthy banter.
It is entirely nonstop. And to a casual outside observer or, a strict military disciplinarian, it seems shockingly inappropriate and unprofessional, especially given their constant, terrifying proximity to a violent death.
It seems like they aren't taking it seriously.
Exactly. But psychologically, if you analyze it, it is deeply necessary.
That's exactly what I was thinking. It's like a psychological pressure valve. When you are trapped inside a claustrophobic metal coffin, surrounded by nothing but cold steel, the smell of burning oil, and the constant threat of the ocean crushing you, talking graphically about life is essential.
It grounds them.
Right, talking about women, about the physical, fleshy world back home, is the only way to remind yourself that you are still a living, breathing, biological human being. If they didn't talk constantly about these hyperhuman flesh and blood things, they would just psychologically shut down.
They would just become silent, depressed extensions of the machinery they're operating.
I agree completely. It is an anchor to humanity, however crude it might be.
And this psychological reality ties perfectly back to a very poignant, tragic observation the commander makes about his own crew.
Hmm.
He looks at these young men bragging and shouting obscenities, and he bitterly refers to them as a children's crusade.
Because they're so young.
Yes. Keep in mind, the vast majority of these enlisted crewmen are 18, 19, maybe 20 years old. They are practically boys. They have almost no actual life experience outside of the Hitler Youth in the Naval Academy. They brag constantly about these wild sexual conquests and epic brawls, but the commander knows it's mostly hollow bravado. But he also notes a terrible irony.
What's the irony?
Their extreme youth, their naivete, is actually their strongest shield against the terror.
Wait, that doesn't make sense to me. I would think the younger guys, the ones with their whole lives ahead of them, would be the most terrified of dying, and the older guys would be more resigned to it. How is their youth a shield?
It's a shield because they haven't lived enough to understand what they're actually losing. They survive the psychological torment of the submarine precisely because they lack the deep imagination and the profound life experience required to truly comprehend the absolute horror of their situation.
Oh, they don't get it yet.
Exactly. They are still wrapped in the protective cocoon of adolescence and military indoctrination. They think they are invincible, or at least they don't fully grasp the finality of death.
Oh, wow. And that directly leads to that incredibly haunting story the commander tells later in the text, doesn't it? The story about rescuing the crew of a sunken destroyer.
Yes. It is one of the most chilling passages in the source material. The commander recounts a previous patrol where his U-boat came across a German destroyer that had been blown apart and sunk by the British.
And they tried to rescue them.
The U-boat pulled up to rescue the survivors floating in the freezing, oil-slicked water, and he observed a stark, horrifying pattern as they pulled the men aboard.
What did he see?
The older men, the veterans in their 30s and 40s, even the ones who were severely wounded, missing limbs, and bleeding heavily, fought viciously, like wild animals, to stay afloat. They screamed for help. They tattled to the burning oil. They simply refused to die.
Because they had a reason to live.
Exactly. They had wives, they had children, they had homes, careers, and a rich, tangible reality to return to. Their roots in the world were deep.
And the young guys.
But the 18-year-olds, the young strutters who had been marching so proudly a few months prior, the commander noted that many of the uninjured teenagers, boys without a single scratch on them, just gave up.
They just stopped fighting.
When the shock hit the freezing water, when the grand illusion of a glorious, noble war finally shattered against the brutal reality of a sinking ship, they had nothing left underneath to sustain them. They didn't have the deep internal anchors of a live life to keep them fighting.
That's heartbreaking.
The commander watched as these uninjured boys simply let their necks go limp in their cork life preservers and allowed themselves to quietly drown in the swells.
Just absolutely chilling. A complete collapse of the spirit before the body even fails. So, to summarize this incredibly heavy, profound journey we've taken through the source material today, we started on land, in the desperate, drunken, completely shattered reality of the Bar Royal.
Watching cynical veterans try to shoot their way out of their own fear.
Right. And we followed them to the coast, marveling at the massive, indestructible concrete bunkers that stand in stark contrast to the fragile, claustrophobic belly of the VIC submarine. We learned the razor-thin, terrifying margins of balancing the boat, where a sack of potatoes can literally mean life or death.
We felt the terror of the crash dive.
Exactly, to escape the airplanes hunting them from the glare of the sun. And we explored the crude, desperate, deeply tragic ways these very young, inexperienced men tried to hold on to their humanity in an environment engineered solely for industrial slaughter.
And if we step back and look at the totality of this text, the focus on the unfeeling machinery, the psychological degradation, the tactical reality of men trapped in a tube, it leaves us with a much larger, highly relevant philosophical question.
one directly inspired by the commander's bitter worldview.
Right. At one point, the commander notes that the men on board his submarine are basically nothing more than links in a chain. They are there merely to turn heavy brass valves, flip electrical switches, and pump water. They are only there to fill the mechanical gaps that the naval engineers hadn't yet figured out how to automate.
In the eyes of the high command, they aren't heroes.
No, they are simply flesh and blood components of a torpedo delivery system.
They are just a biological targeting computer for a bomb.
Precisely. So, if we take that profound observation from 1941 and connect it to the bigger picture of our world today, as we look at the rapid exponential automation of modern warfare, the rise of unmanned drones, artificial intelligence targeting systems, and remote control combat platforms, we have to ask ourselves a very difficult question.
Have we truly removed the human element and the human suffering from the horrors of war?
Or, in our quest for technological perfection, have we simply pushed the human soul further and more invisibly into the cold, unfeeling gears of the machinery? Are the remote drone operators of today sitting thousands of miles away from the front lines, experiencing a cleaner, sanitized version of war?
Or are they, just like the traumatized U-boat men in that metal tube, just another expendable link in a much larger, darker, highly mechanized chain of destruction?
Yes, the correct.
That is a heavy, completely necessary thought to chew on as we wrap this up. To think that that 75% mortality rate, the 30,000 men who went to the bottom of the sea and never came home, were ultimately viewed by their creators as just wet cogs meant to keep an iron tomb balanced underwater.
It's sobering.
It completely and utterly reframes how we think about the intersection of human beings and military technology, both past and present. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We'll see you next time.